Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum History Center. And this morning, our amazing volunteer, Terri Meeks, will be talking about researching newspapers. But before I turn it over to Terri, I just wanted to go over a few general housekeeping notes and some announcements. If you have any questions or comments you would like to share during the program, please type them in the chat box and you can test that out now. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program, and we will make sure all of your questions get addressed at the end of the presentation. If you would like to test, if you'd like to test that feature, you just please type in hello so we know that you can hear us. Also, we want to invite all of you to join us for our next virtual genealogy program with Terri, and that will be on railroads on November 12th. The museum will be posting our online registration for that program in the coming weeks, so please stay tuned. And again, thank you for joining us this morning, and I will now turn it over to Terri.
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. We're going to talk about newspapers today and all the information that you might be able to find in them. So, while we tend to look at newspapers and think about obituaries, there's so much other information that we might be able to find. Newspapers have been around almost since the beginning of the printing press. But in the United States or in the colonies, for the most part, they began in the early 18th centuries. Because printing was a lucrative business initially, printers made pamphlets and announcements, and newspapers were just a sideline initially. They were nominally priced. In fact, they had something called a penny sheet, and they were widely distributed, and they were kind of an advertisement as well for the printers. The first newspaper that appeared here in the colonies was in Boston in 1690, and it was the Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. And unfortunately, it was only a single edition. It came out, it met with some controversy so that the newspaper was actually suppressed after that first edition. And copies of it do still exist today. I was able to grab this one off of the internet, just that one single issue, and I believe it was 4 pages. The first weekly newspaper was the Boston Newsletter, which came out in 1704. And this was the one that it was a single page that was printed on both sides. And it actually became very, very popular in the fight for independence. It took many, many years to get there, 1776, but it did publish some of the controversial articles. Weeklies developed in New York and in Philadelphia, and they had used printing presses that had been imported from England. So it wasn't until 1791 that the first US printing press was actually built and used. Here's a copy. I believe it's from 84. I don't think it's 04. Maybe 7. I can't read it. Anyway, of the Boston Newsletter, and it did continue for quite a number of years. The Pennsylvania Packet and Daily Advertiser was the first daily to come along with regular publication. And it started in 1784, and it is still published today. It is the longest running newspaper in the United States. With the First Amendment guaranteeing freedom of the press, newspapers burgeoned. They flourished in the early 19th century, and actually the heyday of newspapers was from about 1870 to about 1930. We can see the development from about 1820, when there were only 200 newspapers in the country, but within the next decade, that number had more than quadrupled, and then it tripled again by 1860. In its heyday, there were multiple thousands of newspapers. And unfortunately, in our decades, we are seeing the decline of newspapers with the advent of social media. Here is a copy of the Pennsylvania Packet. And you'll notice there's a little bit of artwork. There are different sizes of type. In some cases, some of the newspapers conserved on the cost and only had one size of type. So they didn't have headlines, and it made them very, very difficult to read. The size of the newspaper has varied over the years. This size, we're accustomed to one size nowadays, but in some cases they were larger in olden days, and they were also smaller. So there is no set measurement over the centuries for a standard size. There was the broadsheet, which we still have today, which theoretically is the largest. And they routinely had 6 columns. And they developed when there was a tax imposed on the number of pages. So you had to fit as much information into that single sheet as possible. Therefore, they went to the larger page. Tabloids, the New York Sun was the first that came about in 1833, and they usually had no more than 5 columns. The style of the newspaper, the stories that they covered were different from the broadsheet to the tabloid. And I think in many cases today, that theory still exists. There are shorter stories, they are more condensed, and tabloids have in the later years tended to have a more negative appeal, perhaps less learned. It's not to say that they truly were, but that's the feeling. So, and a tabloid was easier to carry. So we're going to talk in a little bit different order of things this morning. We're going to jump right in and look at where to find these resources for newspapers. There are several subscription services, as you can see, as well as a few free services. I must point out that there is no single service that covers all the newspapers. It's very frustrating to look for newspapers, but I have also noticed just this past week that some local communities are digitizing their newspapers and putting them online. So there may be a state repository, for example, the Historic Colorado Newspapers, which is a free site that has scanned many of the newspapers from Colorado up until about the 1950s or 60s. So there are additional resources. If you're interested in a particular newspaper, try to enter that title into a search and see if you can't find a free site or the actual newspaper itself. We're going to take a look at each one of these sites to see just how much information might be there. I unfortunately do not have a subscription to newspapers.com, but on a relatively frequent basis, they do have free access for a week, a short period of time, a limited period of time. And if you enter, for example, a name or a special keyword, if you're looking for something unique, as well as an approximate date or a range, and start with the state or even the actual location. And they are very good about prioritizing and ordering the information that comes up for your viewing. And we'll take a look at some of the newspaper type articles that you can find in newspapers.com. They do have a very large repertoire of newspapers. Genealogy Bank is another subscription service. I personally have never used this, but I do have acquaintances that have and rely on it very heavily. Here again, there is some overlap with newspapers.com, but there are also some unique newspapers that are in Genealogy Bank. Newspaperarchive.com, another subscription service, and you can do free trials on each of these sites for a limited period of time. Here again, usually about a week, 7 days. And they do carry all sorts of information. I have not used this site either, so I can't actually recommend it, but here again, it is available. And if you're looking for a particular newspaper, it might show up on newspaperarchive.com. Chronicling America is the Library of Congress free website, and they have a large collection of newspapers that you can scan and save the articles to your computer. I have used this on several occasions and have found some very rare and unusual articles about family members. So you never know what you're going to find in these websites. Here is an example of a listing from the Library of Congress, that Chronicling America site. And it gives you a list of sources on where to potentially find information about. And it notes whether they are free or whether they cost. They also have a list of archives and indexes. So we see in Arizona for the city of Tucson that they have the historic Mexican and Mexican American press issues. Explore these lists for the free information to see if perhaps the newspaper that you are looking for might be available. Google has a listing of free access newspapers as well. And a complete alphabet, A through Z, of various newspapers. They talk about how many issues and what the dates for each one of these newspapers might be. They're hard to use because you can't enter a name and find it. You need to go to a specific newspaper and then look at each one of the pages to read. So this is more of a browse opportunity than an actual search and answer opportunity. I had clicked on the Daily Nashua Telegraph from New Hampshire, and you'll notice that they have issues from July of 1889, and then they go vertically, and it's showing 5 of the multiple issues. And then they do August, September, October. So there's a different layout for each one of the newspapers, but you can click on any one of these individual issues and then page through them to see if your ancestor from Nashua, New Hampshire might be recorded. Elefind. This is a free website that does allow you to put in an actual name or a keyword to do searching. This site does not usually have newspapers itself, but redirects you to another website that hopefully has free information. Google Books also does have some newspapers. So whether they were in the newspaper part or whether they're in the book part, you might take advantage to see if you can't find a particular issue on Google. It's a free site here again. Not everything is digitized and not everything is on the internet. So there still are microfilm editions and print editions of newspapers. If the newspaper is still in existence, you might try and contact the actual newspaper office. In many cases, local libraries or museums also have current editions of local newspapers. You can also try to locate the newspaper in its archive or in its repository. Many colleges and universities, the state archives, and museums are the archives for newspapers. And locating each one of these is a distinct possibility. Trying to locate them using that Library of Congress website might be very, very helpful for you. Here again, this is from that Library of Congress website, and it's a listing by state. These are newspaper morgues where old issues of the newspapers might be located. And they have a listing alphabetical by state and the actual city and where the morgue for that newspaper might be found. And so when dealing with searching for newspapers, you have to recognize how the newspapers were digitized and what you might find or the difficulties that you might face in trying to find the information. When doing the scanning, they use what is called optical character recognition, OCR. And that is, as we've seen with the 1950 census most recently, That's how the information was scanned, and an index was actually created. There were errors in that index. There were perhaps misspellings in that index, but the information is there. The quality of the image is also going to depend on the quality of the original. If the original newspaper has smudges, is damaged, is torn in some way, that is going to affect the quality of the scan. When searching for either your family name or a topic, you need to think about how it might appear in the paper. Remember, spelling did not become universal, so to speak, until most people were literate. So the spelling may be very, very different than what it is today. So try to make a list of the spelling variations that you have seen in doing your genealogical research on your family. Don't forget to think about nicknames or abbreviations. Was your relative known by his nickname? Was he called Bubba, even though his name might have been John? Was the John abbreviated? John frequently was abbreviated as JNO, as opposed to the JOHN that we see in most publications today. So think about alternate spellings and different areas that might go wrong in your search. Here again, where was your ancestor at a particular time and place? Don't look for him in the New York Times if he lived in Ohio. Newspapers did pick up stories from local events and did report them in some of the major newspapers, but start with your local region first. We're going to take some time to actually look at what's in the newspapers. We usually look for obituaries, but there is everything recorded. They were the social media of the day, and they did record the daily incidents that went on, whether they were the social comings and goings, or whether they were major news items. So don't overlook businesses. What are the advertisements? Were there openings and closings of stores? Is there a picture of the building? If your people lived in a small town or a rural area, there might be photographs from the newspaper of stores that your relative might have owned, or stores that your relative might have shopped in. Community events were also very popular. Any kind of celebration that went on, whether it be an anniversary or somebody heading off to war or coming home from war, the celebration that might have occurred. There are also those major incidents like wars that affected a particular nation, community, state, etc. And of course, all those natural disasters that might have occurred. There are real estate transactions. So was one of your relatives involved in a foreclosure, or did they receive an eviction notice? Or are they simply, or is their land simply being sold after their death? This information might appear in the newspaper. We also have court proceedings. In addition to the criminal ones, we have civil actions that might be recorded. And around the time of the Spanish-American War, photographs became very, very popular in the newspapers. Photography had developed during the Civil War, but it was hard to get those images into the newspaper. And we'll talk about photographs a little bit later on. And don't forget the advertisements. It will give you an idea of what life was like at a particular point in time. What were grocery prices? How much did it cost to buy a dress or furniture or appliances? We see things and the prices today, but what were those prices like back when your ancestors lived? Here's a popular picture that we used to see very, very frequently, the weddings and engagement announcements. Most of these were put in between the late 1940s and as recently as the 1980s and early 1990s. In many, many cases, anniversaries, 50th wedding anniversaries, or in some cases 60 or 75 years of might deserve a special call out in the newspaper. And photographs, we've got photographs of the brides. I believe this one is from the 1960s. Here's a listing of just a simple social column. And we see that someone is visiting the county. There are small articles about children. There are actually 2 articles in this column about children recovering from diphtheria. So in 1896 in Ridgway, Colorado, there was an epidemic of diphtheria. Did you happen to have an ancestor that lived in the town and died at that particular time? They might not have had a death certificate at that time, and this might give you a clue as to how they might have died. Who is feeling poorly? Who is visiting? The proud father of 8 fine girls was in the village today on ditch business. So if you haven't accounted for this gentleman and all of his family, here's a clue for you. After all, a newspaper article might be some of the only places that your relative might have appeared. Here again, more social news for this particular area. Somebody planting a crop, newcomers to an area. It's really interesting to me that I happen to know this, but Mrs. William McCartney is reported quite ill. Mrs. Frank Ramsey is also quite ill. These 2 ladies are actually related to one another. And we see other people that are visiting or returning, and somebody has moved to an area. Was a child on the honor roll? We frequently don't look at all of the school information that might be available for our ancestors. But things like the honor roll were published in the newspaper. And we see that the silver roll of honor as well as the gold roll of honor, and it names the students for that particular time. This one is much later, but it's just a simple quizzing of young people as to their attitudes. How do you like living in the atomic age? Something that we view, if you were alive during that particular time, it was a very tense time to be alive. The threat of the Iron Curtain versus the United States and the coming of the atomic age after World War II. There were exercises in schools where children were told to hide under their desk as if that would help. So what was it like, and what did your potential student feel about that incident? Does one of your family members have a regular day-to-day job, like a postal carrier? And was there a significant incident that might have caused bodily injury? It's a unique story that might not have been orally passed down through the family, or might have been lost through the generations. And it's something as simple as a newspaper article that can tell you what happened, the threat, and the outcome of the incident. So look for these kinds of things about your potential family members. We mentioned businesses earlier. Did a new business come to town and open up, or were they closing? And what might have been the reason for the closing? Was there an economic condition that resulted in the closing? Or was it simply that the people were selling to move on, or perhaps had just wanted to retire? We've talked a little bit about the buildings that might have existed, and where did your people shop, as well as where might they have owned a business? And of course, there are always potentially various forms of disaster, whether they were floods or fires or a collapse in some cases, like the earthquake in San Francisco. Here's a wonderful photograph of a very large business. And why we have angels and clouds, I have absolutely no idea, but it's a great picture. But did your family live in New Jersey? And did they potentially shop in this store? This was a large institution store that lasted for many, many years. I don't know whether it's still in existence today, but it was, I never lived in New Jersey, but I do remember the name and seeing advertisements for the name of Bamberger in the 1960s. In terms of businesses, was your relative a railroad worker? And this says that Mr. Delaney was promoted or appointed the chief clerk for that. We also see that this gentleman is in charge of the health department for the Pacific Cement Company at View Cove, Dow Island. Is this your relative that might have been in charge of this? So just do some of those name searches throughout to see if you can't pick up little tidbits of information that you might not be aware of. And we've talked about those large incidents. This happens to be from Canton, Ohio, 2 blocks of the business area. If your people happen to live in Canton, Ohio, they might have been affected by this in some way, shape, or form, whether they owned the business or whether they did business with the owners of the businesses. This might have been a significant incident that affected them either positively or negatively. We see listings for all sorts of court proceedings. In some cases, the court proceedings might lead to an entire article, or they might just be a simple listing. But if one of your family members' names shows up even in the listing, you know that then you need to go to the court documents to see what the disposition of the case might have been. This actually comes from my own family. This is an article about a gentleman who was a barber and unmarried. And when he passed away, his heirs, all 35 of them, some of them decided that they wanted to contest the will. And it did go to court. It turns out in the end that the few people that were contesting the will had to renege on their protest. And it turned out that the estate was divided evenly among the 34 surviving, and the 35th share was divided among the 3 children of the deceased relative. I hope that none of my relatives were part of this case. But we've got some individual names of people that appear in it. We have sisters, so we get family relationships. But the fact that it had to go to court and turned up as a whole article in the newspaper is kind of sad. Here is just a simple listing of court proceedings, the people versus, and it's just surnames in this case. Here we've got a couple of things versus McClelland for larceny, not guilty. Another one for McClelland, larceny, verdict, not guilty. Was this the same person with 2 different cases? Or is this maybe a case of brothers, father and son? We don't know. But if you're part of the McClelland family and you suspect that there might have been something, it might be worth trying to find the district court records for this particular time frame. We do see in most cases that these cases were dismissed in one way or shape or other, but here is one where it's Penny versus Owen, and it's a mechanics lien, and there was a decree ordered. So who won in this particular case? And if these are any of your family names, and your people lived in Trinidad at this particular time, you might want to investigate further. Here's a very early one from 1869, and it concerned a divorce. And we do get Mr. Walker is filing for divorce against his wife, Mary Jane, and she wants to get her maiden name back. This is 1869. So we get her married name as well as her maiden name. And we get the gory details about how she was not a pleasant woman. Now, remember, this is all from his point of view. So the petition or the parties, it gives their marriage date as well as the date of their separation. And the article goes on to do a final disposition of the case. But here again, it might be the only place where your ancestors show up in the records. I never realized that abandonment was such a major issue, but this is an entire column of folks from Marshall County in 1892, and it lists the names of the people. We've got Albert Carter versus Sarah Carter, cruel treatment. Minnie Reed versus Andrew, cruel treatment. And we see habitual drunkenness, and we actually get those cases of abandonment. So heaven forbid any of your family members fall into this category, but it did occur, and it's important to realize that it might have happened in your family. Hopefully not. This one happens to be also in the legal business. So-and-so took charge of the office. A late Republican candidate for nomination is doing the opening of the court, and who is acting in charge of the office, who's going to be the bailiff, and here's the person that's in charge of the jail, as well as the various people that are coming up before a judge for some case, whether it be larceny, robbery, murder, etc. Stealing blankets, beating his wife the day after Christmas. Oh my gosh. And confined on a charge of malicious mischief by having knocked down certain mining stakes. So little tidbits of information, but further opportunities for research in court documents. This one happens to deal with immigration. It's really just a social column, but the family of Adolphe LaRuth, they've recently come to Canyon City from Belgium and are staying at the Machaut home, looking for a permanent location, and it gives a connection to other family members. Mrs. LaRuth is the niece of Mrs. Frank Arnold. So further family connections, and how do you connect these people with one another, especially since they have come from Belgium. What was life like during the time period that your ancestors might have lived in a particular location? Whether they were city people or rural people, there is further information to find and to look for in advertisements. We have not only the prices, but what were some of the opportunities for purchasing? We look at the normal things, but were there unusual things that might have been for sale that no longer exist? You know, was there somebody that made buggy whips at the time and sold them. They're no longer in existence today. So, and these are the kinds of things that add depth to your ancestors' life. What are some of the things that you remember from your own personal life that may no longer exist? We've seen the change in telephones, for example, from our youth to the current cell phones. Our children and grandchildren don't know anything about that. We had dinner last night with my daughter and son-in-law, and he recounted a story from a friend of his when talking to his 20-year-old daughter about repairing her cell phone. And he said to get a paper clip and do something with the paper clip. And her response was, "What is a paper clip?" So think about that today. The first paid advertisement wasn't as early as 1704, and it was for selling real estate. So there is a long, long history of advertising. It has been more recently used to defray some of the expense of producing the newspaper. Newspapers, as we learned very early on in this presentation, were originally a sideline for the printers who were issuing pamphlets. And newspapers for a long time either cost a penny, a nickel, or a dime. They are now much more expensive. So, and the advertising lowered the cost for the readers. Here is an ad from the World War II time frame for Macy's. If it's a new game, chances are Macy's developed it. So they were introducing new games this year for Christmas time. Furniture. Fortunately, I've never seen furniture that looks like this, but it's interesting to see how styles might have changed through the decades. The floral prints, I have seen photographs of that families had the floral prints on their sofas and couches. Appliances. How have appliances changed through the decades? And look at the cost. About 1/10 the cost of a current refrigerator. And this is from the 1960s. And this particular area was in a shopping center. So this is very much after the development of areas after the suburban areas after World War II. Did one of your family members have a store, or did somebody do shopping from your family in this shopping center? Okay, so this is one of those items that we don't have nowadays. The hygienic vacuum cap. It forces circulation of blood through the hair roots. It means perfect health for the hair. It's endorsed by leading physicians, 30-day free trial. You wonder about prematurely gray. I'm not sure I would use that if my hair were turning gray. And does it really stop your hair from falling out? I doubt it. And then we have simple but a simple product, flower, but a very elaborate design for advertising a simple household product. Here's another one of those that have gone by the wayside. Gentlemen's garters made without rubber. The elasticity is given by nickel-plated brass springs. Doesn't sound comfortable to me. And we see a cost of 35 cents. This is an advertisement, I believe, from World War II, just simply for Gillette razors. And they wanted all of the troops to be clean shaven. And cars. Cars are always wonderful to see in family photographs, the old cars. They help you date some of those family photographs. So here they are being advertised as new. And look at the width of that car. Much wider, much larger than what we have today. There are all sorts of things that you can find in the newspaper. As we said very early on, what's in a newspaper? Everything, everything and anything. So we see land going up for public sale, farming implements, horses, 5 head of cattle. Notice is hereby given that the undersigned has leased the following sections of land. So he owned the land, but is leasing it. And we have a description of the land. Was one of your relatives involved in war? Newspapers especially started covering Civil War battles as well as Spanish-American War information. There is a lot written about the Civil War in book form. Very little is written about the Spanish-American War. It took place in Cuba. It only lasted 3 months. So newspapers recorded those men that were leaving to go to the war. In most cases, they were National Guard units. So did one of your ancestors participate in that very small war? It's only going to be probably in a newspaper you're going to find that information. This one does happen to be from the Civil War, and I did have an ancestor that was wounded at this in this particular battle, in this particular unit. So an interesting development. Did you have someone that was involved in politics, even at the local level or at the national level? And were there election results? Did they successfully run? Did they lose in that particular election? So who the candidates were, what parties they represented, and what office they might have served in might give additional information for you. And of course, those huge events like the flood in Galveston. Today's generation, they do not remember the assassination of President Kennedy. World War II. There are those national as well as regional and local disasters that might have occurred that in some way, shape, or form affected your family. Don't overlook those. The Johnstown flood, if you lived in Johnstown, Pennsylvania at that particular time, whether your family member passed away or not, whether they were fortunate enough to survive. It changed their lives. So don't overlook this information. Here's a simple one with a wreck at a power plant, and 4 persons were killed, but it shut off the lights and stopped the use of machinery. So people remembered that day and what happened. This is another one of those cases. This happens to be my great-grandfather, and nobody in my family ever talked about this. So it was a total shock to me to find this article in the New York Times, even though my great-grandfather lived in a small town of Cohoes, New York. And there were 3 days of reporting of this particular incident. I had found information in the census where he was in a state hospital, and I just had assumed that it might have been something like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, but no, indeed. And it did help to frame, and it helped me to understand some of the other family lore that had been passed down through the family, even without the mention of insanity. Photography. As we mentioned, photography did develop during the Civil War, but it was not implemented in newspapers until a good 15 to 20 years later. Initially, artists, there were sketches, and in many cases, there were wood engravings that were made that were then printed. And we'll have a couple of examples of those. Halftoning came about in the Spanish-American War, and that's when newspaper and newspaper photography really kicked off. It wasn't, though, until the end of World War I that photographs were routinely published in the paper. And it was very interesting to me that it wasn't until 1977 that colored photographs were introduced into the daily newspapers. I thought that was awfully late date. This is one of those woodcuts. So this is an elaborate design to be printed in a newspaper. It is not a photograph. This indeed is the first photograph that did appear in a newspaper, the Daily Graphic. Pretty stark. So we want you to identify when and where your ancestor lived. Locate that nearest local paper. They might have lived in a remote area where a paper was not published, but where there was a nearby town. Small towns did publish newspapers. It was a valuable source of information for folks so that they could see what was for sale, what was going on, who was visiting from out of town, who was going to town, who was celebrating anniversaries, what children were born. And some of these stories were picked up on a larger regional or even national basis. So make sure to don't overlook newspapers and all the information that they contain. We need to remember that newspapers are secondary sources. We need to recall also that there are errors in newspapers. Just this week, I found a wedding announcement for a couple in the local newspaper. The announcement appeared on 2 consecutive days. The first and the text in both of them was the exact same thing. The photograph of the couple that was getting married, however, was different. So at least one of those newspapers announcements is incorrect. And it's going to take some research to determine which is the correct photograph. So there are errors in newspapers, but they can add so much depth to your story or your ancestors' story. They do help to describe the life and times that surrounded those people. Who were their neighbors and who were the relatives that might have contributed to that newspaper article? And most importantly, newspapers can help to break down the brick walls that you might have discovered in your family. I've said a couple of times that these may be the only record of your ancestors' existence. They may have avoided the census. They may have lived in a period between wars or other significant things where records were not recorded for them. If they lived prior to the recording of vital records, they might not have been located. They can also help to identify women. We saw that 1869 divorce record where the woman's maiden name was recorded. That might be the only one. And especially from the older times, as early as the 1880s, you might find a photograph of one of your family members that you do not have. Was there a great-grandparent that might have appeared in a newspaper, even in death, that did not show up? So with that, we will conclude today. And I see that there are no questions. We thank you for your attendance this morning. If you do have any questions, you can always send me an email. And we'll do one last plug. Next month, November 12th, we're going to talk about railroads and railroad records and the information that might be available or not about them. So thank you very much for your attendance this morning, and we'll see you next month.